Week 28 Overview: Nixon, Détente, and Watergate. This week, our focus is on Richard Nixon's time in office, 1969 to 1974. Nixon had great strengths and weaknesses. He was a skilled leader in many ways, a keen student of history who crafted a new American foreign policy called Détente that eventually reopened diplomatic relations with Communist China, separated China and the USSR, resulted in a solid arms reduction agreement, and generally eased Cold War tensions around the globe. As part of this foreign policy, Nixon also ended American involvement in Vietnam and agreed to bring all the soldiers home. But though the list of his accomplishments was long, there was a correspondingly serious list of faults. His triumphs were marred by the secrecy and high-handedness with which he carried them out. Nixon had a paranoid streak. He sometimes sought to harm others before they could harm him. In the end, his efforts to thwart his enemies led to his own downfall. Nixon was born in California, America's first Pacific president. He served in the Navy in World War II and then became a lawyer before running for Congress. Nixon was a staunch anti-communist who made a name for himself during his cross-examinations of Alger Hiss, an alleged Soviet spy. Nixon ran for the Senate in 1950. He used a clever political trick against his opponent to win him the seat, which earned him the nickname of Tricky Dick. In 1953, Nixon left the Senate to serve as Eisenhower's vice president for 2 terms. Nixon hoped to succeed Eisenhower as president in 1960, but he was narrowly defeated by John F. Kennedy. 8 years later, when the Democrats were badly divided by the Vietnam War, Nixon finally reached the White House. Nixon had the reputation of a cold warrior who opposed communism whenever and wherever he found it. When he came to office, relations between the U.S. and Red China were extremely strained. Nixon quietly began to reach out to Communist China, using the leaders of other nations as intermediaries. After a series of preliminaries, Nixon visited China and met with Mao in February 1972. The world was amazed. The Soviets were amazed and fearful. They didn't want the U.S. and China to build bridges. Nixon used the new tension in creative ways. In 1972, the U.S. held a series of meetings with the Soviets called Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, SALT. The SALT Accords, the first significant arms reduction agreements of the Cold War, were a huge foreign policy victory for Nixon. As relationships eased with the Communists, new problems arose in the Middle East. During the Summer Olympics of 1972 in Munich, West Germany, a Palestinian terrorist group captured 9 Israeli Olympians and killed 2. The terrorists demanded safe passage for themselves and the release of 200 Palestinian guerrillas who were imprisoned in Israel. They threatened to kill the hostages, one by one, if their deadline was not met. Because this occurred at the Olympics, the story made headlines around the world. Israel refused to negotiate with the terrorists, which left the German officials with a problem. They tried an ambush at the airport with tragic results. The police decided to abandon the attempt without informing headquarters, but left just 5 German sharpshooters to try to take out the entire terrorist group. They failed, and all the hostages were executed by their captors in the ensuing battle. Israel retaliated with jet attacks against guerrilla bases and naval installations in both Lebanon and Syria, fueling more violence. The Middle East erupted in war in October 1973. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. With the U.S. backing Israel and Russia supporting the Arabs, the world was as close to a nuclear-powered showdown as it had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. After initial heavy losses, however, Israel managed to hold its own without needing American intervention. Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, helped to negotiate a ceasefire and troop disengagement, which laid the foundation for somewhat more stable relations between the Arabs and Israelis in succeeding years. But the war led the Arab oil-producing countries to cut off oil shipments to the United States, causing a fuel shortage in the U.S., with long lines and rationing at the gas pumps. The embargo ended after a few months, but that short-term measure had some long-term implications, which we will follow for the rest of this unit. America had its own war to deal with. Nixon had campaigned on the pledge that he had a secret plan to remove American soldiers from Vietnam and bring peace with honor. Like so many campaign promises, that was a lie. In truth, he had no plan before he took office. The plan that he announced in office was labeled Vietnamization. It meant training up Vietnamese soldiers and withdrawing U.S. ground troops, all supported by secret bombing operations in the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos. This escalation didn't go unnoticed back home. Students angrily protested the president's action on college campuses throughout the U.S. In one such protest at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen fired on students, killing 4 and wounding 9. After this incident, a crowd of 100,000 demonstrators marched on Washington in the largest and most dramatic anti-war protest to date. Nixon responded to the protests by withdrawing ground troops from Cambodia. Congress also responded. It repealed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which had originally given LBJ authority to conduct the war. This ended Nixon's executive authority to continue the war as he chose. With his powers limited, Nixon again ordered U.S. air support for an invasion of Laos in early '71, but he continued to withdraw American troops from Vietnam to placate the protesters. Finally, in January 1973, the Americans and North Vietnamese met in Paris and signed the Paris Accords, which announced America's complete withdrawal and the return of all prisoners of war. So much for Nixon's promise to end the war with honor. Another of Nixon's campaign promises was to appoint federal judges who would uphold law and order. When Nixon took office, Earl Warren was Chief Justice of a Supreme Court which had promoted liberal policies in the fields of civil rights, civil liberties, and church-state relations. Nixon promised that if he were elected president, he would appoint justices who would show more restraint. He got the chance to change the court. Nixon appointed 3 new justices to the Supreme Court and replaced liberal Justice Earl Warren with a more conservative Chief Justice, Warren Burger. These new justices made some difference on the court, but it was not all to the good. One of Nixon's new justices, Harry Blackmun, made a big splash with his opinion in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in all 50 states. America is still dealing with the consequences of that choice to this day. As Nixon began to prepare for his re-election campaign in 1972, the New York Times ran a series of articles on a secret government study, popularly called the Pentagon Papers. These papers released information about how the federal government had deceived the American people about many significant aspects of the Vietnam War. This unauthorized disclosure of top-secret information severely weakened Nixon's chances of getting reelected. Nixon decided it was time to stop such leaks, so he created a special unit he called the Plumbers to deal with it. Nixon directed his re-election committee, known as CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President, to secure his victory through a series of espionage acts against the Democratic Party. He also authorized a program of dirty tricks, which he purposed to tarnish the reputations of his Democratic opponents. 5 burglars were caught breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Building in Washington, D.C. It was then discovered that they were working for Nixon in ways that were not only beyond the president's constitutional power, but also employed both deceit and corruption. Although the White House staff declared they had nothing to do with the burglary, a long-term investigation found one after another of Nixon's staff guilty. The election came and went while the investigation continued. Nixon was reelected, but he was soon implicated in far more serious crimes than had previously been alleged. It became clear that Congress would impeach him, and the Senate would probably convict him. In order to prevent this, President Nixon resigned on August 10, 1974. He was the first, and so far the only, president to resign from the office. By all accounts, Nixon was a complex man, difficult to fathom. He seems to have been both brilliant and base, and to have swung widely from euphoria to discouragement. He seems to have believed himself to be a great man working alone and in secret for the good of all, and therefore above the checks and balances that govern American democracy. In 1788, James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the government, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." Nixon's efforts to evade those checks proved their necessity. He fell, but he did not take the nation with him. The constitutional structure that the founders had erected stood firm.